Hey folks, today in class we got about, I don't know, 65% of where I wanted to get to, which is not terribly surprising since I spent time talking about things like Asanisipia. So we got through the first compromise that was decided at the Constitutional Convention. That was federalism. That's the federal government gets some powers, the state governments are going to get powers, and then there's going to be shared powers. We talked about the three clauses: the Commerce Clause, the Supremacy Clause, and the Necessary and Proper Clause, that really tend to give more power ultimately to the federal government than the state governments. We talked about the fact that government is divided into three different branches: the executive, which executes the laws, the legislative branch, which makes the laws, and the judicial branch, which is supposed to interpret the laws. And then we talked about how each branch actually can check the other branches to keep them from getting too powerful. Now we're going to talk about the controversial second compromise, which is about representation, namely how people are going to represent their states in this legislative branch. So there was the Virginia plan, of which there were going to be two houses, bicameral, okay? Actually, much like England's parliament was set up. The New Jersey plan was the smaller state plan, whereas the Virginia plan was the larger state plan. So in the New Jersey plan, it was going to be just one house, okay? Everybody's going to go to one house to make the laws. That's the way it was under the Articles of Confederation. Under the larger state plan, the Virginia plan, the number in both houses would be based on population. So if you had two houses, each one would be based on population so that the bigger states would have more people than the smaller states. And the New Jersey plan, the number of the members in the one house would be the same from every state. Okay. So it'd be like one house and potentially two people from each state, like it was under the Articles. The Virginia plan is a little weird in that the lower house, okay, would be directly elected by the people. Okay. So the people in the state would elect the lower house, and then the lower house would elect the upper house. So, for example, it would be like Massachusetts, the people of Massachusetts would represent people to represent them in the lower house. And then the Massachusetts representatives in the lower house would elect the people to the upper house. So in the bigger plan, the larger state plan, the larger states would always win. In the smaller state plan, it was a real sort of way to make sure that the smaller states retain their power. Now, the compromise is between these plans: the bigger state plan, the Virginia plan, the smaller state plan, and the New Jersey plan. So the compromise, there's going to be two houses. So that takes from the Virginia plan. The number of the members in the House of Representatives, one of those houses, is going to be based on population. So one of the houses is going to be based on population with a minimum of one representative from that state. That still exists today. There's still one representative states like Wyoming, okay, or Alaska. Now, those representatives would be elected directly by the voters and would serve for 2 years. So House members always elected by the people who could vote. And again, at the beginning, it was just sort of propertied white men. And they'd serve for 2 years. They'd constantly be up for reelection. In the other house, the Senate, every single state would have two people. That's the same today. We have two senators from each state, makes it 100. We have actually 435 representatives once you take all the big states and the small states, you put it all together. But until the early 1900s, those senators were elected by the state legislatures. So think about this. If we're looking at Massachusetts, Massachusetts would elect its representatives to the House. In Washington, it would elect people down to its capital. I think their capital is Boston. I hope it's not Springfield. I think it's Boston. They'd elect them to Boston, and then that legislature in Boston would then elect someone to the Senate. So it was not just one, but two people to the Senate. So this is the compromise. It's supposed to sort of balance the large states and the small states. Each would have sort of a place that they could call their own. The small states, the Senate would be great because every state would have two. The large states would be able to dominate in the House because, again, it was based on population. Now, the third compromise, or what I like to call the third fraction fifth compromise, or the 3/5 compromise, it's important to know that the word slave is mentioned no place in the Constitution. You will not see the word slave. You'll not see enslaved persons. You'll see other persons, which people understood to be slaves. But it does address slavery in three different ways in the Constitution, if not explicitly so. This is a weird math here. And I apologize to those of you that are really in like high Stevenson math because this doesn't make any sense. Okay. The South wanted every slave to be counted as the same as a white person, so one for one, when it came to political representation. That meant that they could have everybody in their state, black and white, be counted for representation, which would help them in the House of Representatives. But then when it came to taxation, they wanted every white person to be counted as one and every slave to be counted as zero. So basically, they wanted the political boost, but they didn't want to have to pay more money based on the population. The North wants the opposite, okay? They go, we want every single slave to be counted when it comes to taxation. So the South is punished that way, but we don't want them to be rewarded in the House of Representatives when it comes to counting population for political purposes. So instead of like going right down the middle, half, they went to 3/5, which is a totally weird number. But at the time, it was considered that a slave could do the work basically 3/5 of what a white person could do, which makes no sense because if that's the basically the work rate, then you would have white people doing all the work. But the 3/5 compromise basically says that slaves will be counted as 3/5 of a white person when you're counting people for population and political power in the House, but also 3/5 for taxation. So the North wins on taxation, the South wins on population. I'm going to tell you right now, the South has a much bigger win in terms of political power because political power is going to mean something, not just in the late 1700s, but all the way up through the mid 1800s. Additionally, the Constitution says that the earliest that the slave trade, that just means slaves coming in from outside the United States, it could not be abolished before basically the last day in 1807. It is going to be abolished on 1108. So that will actually happen. But basically, they're pushing it off and saying, we're not going to deal with this for 20 years. They also create what's known as a fugitive slave law that basically says slaves are property. And if they go from one state to the other, they have to be returned. But in no case do they ever mention the word slaves. And one of the reasons that they never went sort of hard after slaves is they figured that, you know what, if they went hard after this idea of slavery, that the South would never agree to any of this. And they needed the North and the South to both agree for this new sort of compact to work. Okay. Now, in terms of electing the president, they had some difficult decisions they had to make. They figured that they couldn't have every single person voting for the president because they thought not every single person sort of understands politics. Even those people that can vote don't understand. So we're going to make sure that basically there's more educated and enlightened people who do this. So they created something called the Electoral College, which was going to be the official electors of the president. Now, it's important to understand that every group to this day, even though people don't necessarily like it, even in 2020, the number of electors that your state has is based on how many representatives plus how many senators you have. So, like California has 53 representatives and 2 senators, like every state does. So they have 55. Illinois has the fifth most, but we only have 20. So we have 18 representatives and 2 senators. Wyoming, 1 representative, 2 senators. They have 3. In every state, it's what we call a winner take all. So if in the election coming up, Donald Trump wins Illinois by 1 vote, he gets all 20 of our electoral votes. He will not win Illinois because Illinois is what we call a blue state, but I'm just putting that out there as an example. So basically, you only basically focus on states that there's a chance that it's a toss-up in. So Trump wouldn't campaign in like what we call blue states because he doesn't have a chance of winning there because it's basically whoever wins the popular vote, all of their electoral votes go to that person. So like, it's very obvious that Biden's going to win California. It's like 55 right in the bank right there. But there's a lot of other states, particularly in the Midwest and the Southeast, that are up for grabs. Now, you have to get a majority of the electoral votes. Today, it's 270, pardon me. That you have to get is 270 out of 538 total. You could, in theory, win the popular vote. Okay, you get more votes around the country and still lose in the Electoral College. That has certainly happened in our history. That happened to Hillary Clinton back in 2016. It happened to Al Gore in 2000. Okay. And of course, I must have made this. No, I did. Hillary Clinton's on there, not Bill. Hillary. Now, we actually know much more about removing the president now because we actually had an attempted removal of the president earlier this year. It's hard to believe that that was actually still 2020. So Congress has the power to impeach, which means to formally accuse. The House does that. So they basically set up a mechanism so that the president could be removed if a majority of the House votes to say, you know what, you're accused. But then there has to go to the trial phase. And that's very, very tough. So it goes from just a majority to 2/3 of the Senate, which at this case means, of 167. We've had now 3 presidents. This is from last year, so it doesn't reflect Trump, but 2 presidents had been impeached prior to Trump, Andrew Johnson and William Jefferson Clinton. Neither was found guilty by the Senate, and they stayed in office. That's exactly what happened to Trump. So there's a funky way of electing the president and a funky way of removing the president. But what you should know is about the 2 branches I've told you so far. The legislative branch, only one of those 2 parts is directly elected by the people, at least initially until 1913. That's the House. The president is not directly elected by the people. So really, this was sort of keeping, elections away from the people in many ways, going to that suspicion sort of the mob, not the mafia, but the mobocracy. Now, when we look at the Constitutional Convention, you had this question of, would it stay one branch? No, we actually know that it's going to be ultimately 3 branches. So it's going to be executive, legislative, and judicial. How would representation in the legislative branch be determined? Well, we have 2 branches, 1 House based on population, 1 Senate, same for everybody. Would slaves, how would they be counted? Okay, were they ultimately property? And at the end of the day, they're counted partly 3/5 when it comes to political power and 3/5 when it comes to taxation, and they are considered property as we saw in the fugitive slave law. Now, I'm sorry. Now, that took a while, and I apologize. I had to go through those notes. So the ratification process. So the Constitution is a series of compromises. You could call it the Compromise Convention, federalism, and then you got those clauses in there: supremacy, necessary and proper, commerce. And then you got the Great Compromise about representation. You got the 3/5 compromise. So basically, everyone thought that the Articles of Confederation were being just revised. No one outside of Philadelphia knew that they were actually got a new document. So they came up with this new plan, and they sort of changed the rules. Because remember, under the Articles of Confederation, every state had to agree to any changes. That's 13 out of 13. This convention changes the rules. They basically said every state needs to come up with its own body, not their Congress, but their own body called a convention. And at that convention, 9 out of the 13 states have to ratify it. So it's not 13 out of 13. It's not a simple majority, but it's a super majority, 9 out of 13. It was either yes or no. So a state convention says we want it or we don't. There could be no changes made to the Constitution until it had been ratified by 9 states. Okay, at that point, amendments could be added. Basically, Rhode Island still, who had not gone to the Constitutional Convention, they're still not down with this whole thing. So they're suspicious of it. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really get into my deep antipathy of Delaware. I don't believe it should be a state. Sorry, Joe Biden. But they are actually, just to sort of spite me, they're the first state to ratify the Constitution. They do it pretty quickly, but it doesn't mean anything because there's got to be 8 more states. Okay. Now, what we have here is we have 2 groups of factions. They're not political parties. They're groups that emerged. Some are for the Constitution and some are against it. And that's really what your debation is about on either Monday or Tuesday. Apologies, Tuesday or Wednesday. So there's supporters of the Constitution that call themselves the Federalists. They are in favor of this new federal government. They're better organized. They just have sort of, I'm not going to say smarter people, but they got more sophisticated people on their side. They have the support of Franklin and Washington. Franklin is like Mr. America going all the way back, and Washington's Mr. America as a result of not just, his Revolutionary War exploits, but certainly, he was the head of the Constitutional Convention. So both of these 2 guys are at the convention, and they're very much supporters of it. And they've also got 3 really smart dudes. They got Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. This trio is going to write what are known as the Federalist Papers. If you have heard or seen Hamilton, the soundtrack that actually comes up. So the Federalist Papers are only written to get New Yorkers on board. New York is such an important state that they're going to dedicate all this time and energy to try to convince New Yorkers, many of whom are very skeptical of this new Constitution, on board. The most famous of these many Federalist Papers, and again, most of them are actually written by Hamilton, is Madison's Federalist number 10. Now, if you know Liana McGee, she's the student body president. She's one grade older than you guys. She can actually give you the best description of the Federalist number 10 that I've ever heard. That's why her name is actually number 10. But let me do my best because I'm not as good as Liana. Okay. So basically, there was an assumption that a republic where the power was, with the people, Republican as in a little r, that it could only be done in a small area, that you couldn't actually have a big area and actually have people's voices to be heard. Because the assumption was is that in a big area, all these little factions would break out and there'd be no way for the people's voice to actually be heard, that there'd be sort of total chaos. Well, Madison gets counterintuitive, and I'm going to move my face so you can see this. He gets counterintuitive and he goes, no, 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 no. It's not that these factions are going to emerge, there's going to be chaos, but these factions will all basically check each other and there'll be no one that will be able to dominate. So he said, it's not that a large republic wouldn't work, it's that it would totally work because all these groups would just neutralize each other and we'd actually have harmony. So Madison presents this, in some ways, theory that people are like, what? I hadn't thought about that way. That's interesting. And in the end, it does help convince the New Yorkers to go for the Constitution. Now, it's important to recognize that even if they got 9 out of 13, if they didn't have New York and they didn't have Virginia, they wouldn't have been able to move forward. There's just such political power, just in terms of not only the economies, but how many people were in those two particular states. Now, it's important to know that there's a group called the AntiFederalists, and it's sort of unfortunate that they got that name because the Federalists sort of emerge and take that name, and then the other group's like, well, we're anti what they are. Now, the Anti-Federalists are not some woebegone group. They're actually pretty strong as well. They say we're the revolutionaries. Like, we're the ones who are looking back at this and saying, in 1776, we fought against tyranny. You are now creating this basically Britain Part 2. Why would we go back and give so much power to a central government? Did we not fight against the British for this? They're sort of looking around saying, am I taking crazy pills here? We're going right back to this. And they're claiming that at the end of the day, that this government is probably going to do just what the British government did to the colonists. They're going to increase, taxes. They're going to basically do away with the states. They're going to make it, so at the end of the day, there are no states. It's just a federal government. They're going to be all for the rich and the well-born over the common people, and they're going to abuse people when it comes to their liberties. And that it's really, really important to understand, and we'll get to this a little bit in a minute, but it's this idea that if you have a central government, they'll be tyrannical, and the government is not basically prohibited from doing anything because they said the Constitution doesn't have a Bill of Rights in it. And all these different states that had bills of rights that basically said what their government could and couldn't do relative to the people. And so they said, you know what, you're creating this monster and it's going to hurt the common man. And in the end, you haven't actually done anything to protect us. Our freedoms can be totally run over. And they said you have to have a Bill of Rights because it's only if you have a Bill of Rights that you actually can spell out what the government can and can't do. And so many of the Anti-Federalists said, we're only going to go for a constitution, this constitution, if you can guarantee us that there will be a Bill of Rights. But there's no promise because, as I said, as part of the ratification process, you either voted as a state delegation yes or no. You didn't get to say, I want these changes made. You had to keep your fingers crossed and trust that it would happen. So again, the Federalists are the ones who have looked at the scene of this, critical period, and they've said, this has been really, really bad. Like they looked at Shays' Rebellion, and they said, mobocracy is bad. We have so much to lose. And the Anti-Federalists looked at it and said, we have so much to lose if we allow this tyrannical central government to take over and we give all the power back to the man, to the establishment. What's going to happen to the common man in the process? Okay. So the debate between them really comes down to two fears. The Federalists are afraid of disorder, anarchy, chaos, the mobocracy. What happens if the little guy actually gets too much power and wants us gone? The Anti-Federalists are not like pro-anarchy, but they're much more concerned about concentrated power. Like what happens if there's no voice for the little guy? And they say, you know what? Like, we think this is problematic because the people will never have a voice. And the Federalists are sort of like, that's the point. We want the people to not have a voice. So hopefully this is helpful to you, particularly the part about the Federalists and Anti-Federalists and Bill of Rights and ratification process as you prepare for your debation. So be good, prep hard, make sure that you know that, again, we're not just interpreting the primary sources, we're including information about this time period so that we can argue either that the Constitution is helping create a more perfect union and secure the blessings of liberty, or it's not. It's a danger to those. All right. Adios.